In the torrid summer of 1999, as a record-breaking heat wave gripped the East Coast, John F. Kennedy Jr. was preparing for a death, but it wasn't his own. By then, Anthony Radziwill had been losing his fight against cancer for several years, and he was fading. To the world, he was the son of a Polish prince and a president's nephew. To John F. Kennedy Jr., he was the soulmate and the brother he never had. While Anthony lay in a hospital bed with a heart expanded to 3 times its normal size, John was holding vigil, obsessively reading books on the stages of grief and rehearsing the eulogy he expected to give. He wanted the words to be perfect for the man who had been his ally in a confusing world. But on July 16, 1999, fate executed a cruel and catastrophic U-turn. John boarded his Piper Saratoga with his wife, Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, and her sister Lauren for a quick hop to a family wedding, but they never arrived. Instead, the plane plunged into a graveyard spiral off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, hitting the water at 200 miles per hour. The world was stunned by what many considered to be another iteration of the so-called Kennedy curse. But they actually missed the most heart-wrenching detail of all. The man who was supposed to deliver a eulogy became the eulogy himself. Anthony Radziwill, the man everyone thought was out of time, was the one that had to sound the alarm when John's plane went missing. A week later, at John's memorial, a frail and fragile Anthony had to summon his final strength to hobble up to the altar and bid farewell to his best friend. Anthony survived John by just 25 days, finally succumbing to his illness on August 10th of that year. In the end, he didn't just lose a cousin, he lost the man who was supposed to be by his side until his final breath. In the shadowed history of the Kennedys, this is one of the cruelest ironies. JFK Jr. unknowingly spent his final days preparing to say a goodbye he would never live to deliver. While he meticulously prepared for the death of his closest confidant, fate was quietly preparing for his, and a dying Anthony Radziwill had to watch his indestructible best friend disappear first. This is the poignant story of John F. Kennedy Jr. and the brother he never had. Hello, my restless friends. Welcome to Too Lady to Rest, where we come together to spill some vintage tea. Hi. Life is lonely at the top. Few people knew this better than John F. Kennedy Jr. To be a Kennedy was to be a walking myth, to serve as a touchstone for a whole nation's nostalgia, to be seen as the natural heir to a martyred legacy. This existence was inherently isolating, as John was forced to grow up within a protective bubble of Secret Service agents, and later navigate a fishbowl existence where he was relentlessly pursued by a wolf pack of paparazzi. He frequently described himself as being 2 different people, wearing a public mask to meet the world's insatiable fascination, while privately struggling to develop an authentic self, separate from the ghost of his father. Perhaps most isolating was the uncomfortable reality that the public often claimed to remember more about John's childhood than he did himself, a bittersweet reality that left him hungry to be perceived as a regular person, as a regular kid. John's mother, Jackie, strove to provide as much protection from this as she could while raising her kids as essentially a single parent. This meant that as he grew up, John became less of a Kennedy and more of a Bouvier, because Jackie was extremely close with her sister Lee, whose children, Tina and Anthony, were around the same age as John and his sister Caroline. Jackie, Lee, and their children spent a significant amount of time together as the kids grew up. This allowed the sisters to adopt a sort of joint approach to raising their kids, with Jackie treating Tina and Anthony as her own, while Lee did the same with John and Caroline. Though the cousins spent the school year in different countries, their summers together in Aristotle Onassis' private island of Skorpios allowed the boys in particular to develop a soulmate-level bond with each other, simply described by Anthony's sister Tina as quote-unquote a special chemistry. Hi, just a quick note. If you find value in these stories and would like to help support a channel that's ran by a good old-fashioned human being, check out my Patreon and Ko-fi links below. And channel memberships are also available. Otherwise, just liking, subscribing, and commenting on the videos really helps out the channel. So please make sure to do that if you haven't yet, and back to our story. In temperament, they were total opposites. John was messy and rambunctious. He probably had ADHD, while Anthony was neat, serious, and reserved. And yet they were almost like two sides of the same coin, so attuned to each other that they could do perfect impressions of one another. It was a friendship of constant competitive teasing. John never missed a chance to needle Anthony about his royal blood. Through his father, Radziwill, Anthony was technically a Polish prince, so John would affectionately mock him by calling him Petit Prince, or simply Principe. After Anthony's first bout with cancer, which we'll talk about in a moment, John affectionately but crudely nicknamed him Old One Ball. He was always ready to stir the pot. Like the time Anthony grumbled about an elderly woman stalling the grocery line, and John turned to their friends with a straight face and said, "Do you know that Anthony hates children and old people?" Beyond the constant teasing and poking, they lived in a world of their own. They developed a private shorthand, a collection of inside jokes and secret languages that made the rest of the room disappear when the two of them got together. They'd often communicate entirely in code, trading lyrics from the musical Guys and Dolls, a favorite of John's since his college acting days, as a hidden language that pretty much only the two of them understood. And Anthony was perhaps the only person that John trusted with his innermost secrets. And the feeling was mutual. Their connection was so powerful that in 1998, John was able to bring Anthony back pretty much from the brink of death. Although doctors assured Anthony at the time that the cancer was in remission, it returned with a vengeance as an aggressive sarcoma in January of 1994. The same year, Anthony married Carol DeFalco, a fellow journalist he'd met while they were both covering the Menendez trial. John stood as Anthony's best man, a gesture Anthony returned 2 years later when John married Carolyn Bessette. Carol recalls that either on the same day or the same week they got the news that Anthony's cancer was back, they were also broken the news that Anthony's aunt, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, was battling cancer herself. This meant that John was about to lose two of the most important people in his life. Much like John trusted Anthony implicitly, John was one of the few people that Anthony trusted with the truth about his first diagnosis. And John, being John, responded the way he responded to everything that scared him, by making it smaller, by making it a joke so that they could both live through it. Hence, Old One Ball. It might sound cruel out of context, but in context, it was an act of love. It was John refusing to let Anthony disappear into his illness and trying to keep up some sense of normalcy. As Carol relates in her 2005 memoir, What Remains, John could always be counted on to make everybody in the room feel at ease, a superpower he was very much aware of, and a relief he was happy to provide every time. Anthony proceeded to fight the cancer for the next 5 years. Throughout, John's unique brand of brotherly humor was just one of the many ways in which John was determined to be helpful and useful to his beloved cousin, treating him with such loving care that on one occasion, it moved his Kennedy cousins to tears. Remember when I said that John pulled Anthony from the brink of death? Listen to Carol describe this incredibly touching moment. And I really hope I don't get in trouble for including this clip, because I just don't think that I can do it justice.
Anthony almost died 3 times in 1999. I'll never forget the first time we were in ICU in New York. Carolyn and I had been there all night, and John was at a black tie event, and he came directly from the event. And I remember him walking into the ICU in a tuxedo, and Anthony was in his hospital gown, hooked up to a dialysis machine. And John just went over to Anthony and held his hand. And he started singing this childhood song, I guess, that they grew up singing, called A Teddy Bear's Picnic. Slowly, you could hear Anthony start singing along with him. It was heartbreaking. I mean, it was heartbreaking. Carol and I just sat there in the chair, and I mean, tears were streaming down our face. The doctors thought he was gonna die that night, and I think, John just wanted to take him to the safest place he knew.
Carol also shared that John once confessed to her that he was afraid that if he stopped joking, Anthony would realize how dire the situation was and would just give up and die. John remained in some degree of denial until that fateful summer of 1999, when a trip to the beach revealed to John for the first time just how frail Anthony had become, with the scars from his many operations thrown in stark contrast by Anthony's thinness. This made John's stoic facade crumble completely, and Carol describes that was the first time she ever saw John sobbing, hiding his face in a crumpled t-shirt so that Anthony wouldn't see. John's whole strategy in life for coping with his considerable anxiety involved movement and vigorous physical activity. But that summer, a broken ankle prevented him from that outlet, an injury he had sustained, by the way, in a flying accident, and the broken ankle also prevented him from flying. This meant that John spent those last few weeks with nowhere to run and basically focused on preparing for Anthony's death. John began reading books on the stages of grief and urging Carolyn Radziwill to help him make sure that Anthony accepted his impending death. John inquired daily after Anthony's health and tried to be as present as possible during his cousin's treatment. Shortly before his own death, John told Carol he'd started working on Anthony's eulogy. Adding to the tension of those last few weeks was the fact that John's pet project, George magazine, was being dropped by its publisher, and John was running around in search of new investors to keep the drowning magazine alive. And there was more. He and his wife, Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, had been growing distant for a while, and John had reportedly been staying at a hotel prior to their fatal flight. Carolyn's life was also becoming unbearable. Between the constant pressure of the paparazzi and John being so focused on his work, she was already reaching her limit. Watch my previous video on the Bessette-Kennedys for more detail about Carolyn's mental state. And then, on top of all that, came Anthony's illness. Being extremely close with both Anthony and his wife Carol, Carolyn often spent her nights at the hospital, acting as a caretaker and support system for Carol as she watched Anthony's health slowly fail. It must have been exhausting. Eventually, the blur of hospital visits and the need to be perfect in the eyes of the public made Carolyn feel like a caged animal. And throughout all that, she felt abandoned by John in that grief, and she began to pull away from him emotionally. So with all this weighing on his mind and his ankle barely healed enough, on July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. finally got back in the air, planning to fly himself, his wife, and her sister Lauren first to Martha's Vineyard to drop off Lauren, and then to Hyannisport to attend the wedding of his cousin Rory. That night, the Radziwills were staying at John's house on Martha's Vineyard when they got the call that John's plane was missing. Carol immediately took charge of the search, contacting every nearby airport and eventually reporting their plane missing to the Coast Guard. Despite his extreme frailty, Anthony was tasked with the heart-wrenching job of tracking down John's sister, Caroline, who was in Idaho, to deliver the news. Though he ultimately wasn't strong enough to deliver the eulogy himself, leaving the task to John's uncle, Ted Kennedy, Anthony made sure he went up to the altar to at least say a psalm. Anthony was also the executor of John's estate, meaning he had to meet with lawyers and make important decisions while in this fragile state. The loss of John and Carolyn really shattered Carol and Anthony's sustained illusion of normalcy. Reading Carol's harrowing account of those final weeks makes me really appreciate her strength and resilience. They even managed to throw a little birthday party for Anthony on August 7th. On the morning of August 10th, however, Anthony woke up with difficulty breathing and was rushed to the hospital, where he died several hours later in the loving arms of his wife. In the end, though John had intended to bear witness to Anthony's final moments on Earth, it was Anthony's diminished figure that remained instead. In a twist of fate that sounds almost too cruel to be true, but it's somehow not the worst thing that happened to the Kennedys. No one knows why that family has, historically, been such a lightning rod for public tragedy. But even Anthony, despite being only an honorary member of the Kennedy family, thanks to his closeness with John, briefly became a central figure in the mythology of the Kennedys. In her memoir, What Remains, Anthony's widow Carol chronicles a season of what Anthony's mother Lee called loss upon loss, a term she had first used when Robert Kennedy was assassinated just a few years after JFK. Carol was so traumatized by the sudden deaths of John and Carolyn, the two people who were meant to be her lifeline and her support system as Anthony faded, that those final 25 days between their deaths and Anthony's death were a complete blur to her. She shares that the reality of her widowhood didn't sink in for the longest time. Her mind kept going back to that one phone call that had changed everything, anchored by the irrational fantasy that it could have somehow turned out differently, and they would still be by her side. The aftermath of 1999 could have easily destroyed Carol, but she worked through her grief and managed to forge a path that was uniquely hers. By publishing her memoir, What Remains, she not only processed her grief, but she gave the world a window into the human side of a myth, before pivoting into a career in reality TV that kept her in the cultural zeitgeist. That's all I have for you today, friends. There's really not that much controversy in this one. I just wanted to share a portion of JFK Jr.'s history that I find extremely touching. And I'd love to know your thoughts about this aspect of their tragedy. If you enjoy the video, please share it, engage with it, and if you want to continue binging, you can watch this one next.